Barely concealed snickers erupted from the designer-clad relatives as a crisp $1 bill was slid across the polished mahogany desk. Evelyn's ruthless ex-husband, Donovan, had already left her completely bankrupt, and now her late billionaire uncle had orchestrated this final, theatrical insult. Standing in the freezing law office with an eviction notice waiting at home, Evelyn simply threw her head back and laughed at the sheer absurdity of it all. She had no idea that 24 hours later, that same stiff-suited lawyer would arrive at her cramped apartment in a blacked-out SUV, whispering, "Pack a bag immediately. That dollar is a decoy key to a hidden empire, and they are already hunting you." The rain in Seattle that Tuesday morning felt less like weather and more like a personal grievance. It drummed relentlessly against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Whitmore, Hughes, and Gable, a boutique law firm perched on the 42nd floor of the Columbia Center. Claire Caldwell stood dripping onto the plush Persian rug, acutely aware that her thrift store trench coat smelled faintly of damp wool and the grease from the diner where she worked the closing shifts. She was 32 years old, though the deep circles under her hazel eyes and the sharp, exhausted lines around her mouth made her look older. Just 14 months ago, she had been the wife of Richard Harding, a prominent real estate developer whose charm was only outweighed by his sociopathic talent for hiding assets. When the divorce finalized, Richard had manipulated the courts, leveraged offshore accounts, and employed a team of ruthless attorneys to ensure Claire walked away with nothing but her maiden name, full custody of their 7-year-old son, Leo, and a mountain of legal debt. Now, she was here, summoned by a cryptic letter regarding the last will and testament of her great-uncle, Arthur Pendleton. Arthur had been the black sheep of the Pendleton dynasty. While the rest of the family built their fortunes in tech and pharmaceuticals, rubbing elbows with senators and tech moguls, Arthur had retreated to the shadows decades ago. He was a rumored eccentric, a man who made his fortune in rare antiquities and private land acquisitions, isolating himself from the venomous greed of his siblings and nieces. Claire hadn't seen him since she was a little girl. Yet, out of nowhere, the summons had arrived. "If everyone could please take their seats," a baritone voice announced. Thomas Gable, a senior partner with silver hair, perfectly coiffed and a suit that cost more than Claire's annual rent, stood at the head of the massive conference table. Around the table sat the vultures: Claire's Aunt Sylvia, draped in aggressively expensive cashmere, her cousin Beatrice, frantically typing on her phone without looking up, and her Uncle Robert, who was already swirling a glass of the firm's complimentary scotch. Claire took a seat at the very edge of the table, pulling her damp coat tighter around herself. She didn't belong here. The Pendletons had cut her off the moment she married Richard, ironically, because they deemed Richard too new money, and they had entirely ignored her when she was left destitute. Gable cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses. He read through the standard legal jargon, distributing the expected millions. Sylvia received the penthouse in Manhattan. Robert got the controlling shares in the family's pharmaceutical subsidiary. Beatrice was handed a sprawling vineyard in Napa Valley. With every asset announced, the air in the room grew thicker with smug satisfaction. Then, Gable paused. He shuffled the heavy parchment papers, his expression completely unreadable. He looked up, his eyes locking directly onto Claire. "And finally, to my great niece, Claire Caldwell," Gable read, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave. The room went dead silent. Beatrice stopped typing. Aunt Sylvia leaned forward, her eyes narrowing like a hawk spotting a field mouse. "To Claire," Gable continued, reading from the will, "who always possessed a spirit too fierce for the gilded cages of this family, I leave my deepest sympathies for her recent hardships. However, as she has chosen a life disconnected from the Pendleton legacy, I leave her the sum total of $1. May she spend it with the same wisdom she has shown in her personal life." A beat of silence passed, and then Beatrice let out a sharp, breathless giggle. Robert covered his mouth to mask a cough that was clearly a laugh. Sylvia just smiled, a cold, thin line of pure vindication. Gable reached into his leather folio. He didn't pull out a check. He pulled out a crisp, brand-new, physical $1 bill. He walked down the length of the long table, the sound of his Italian leather shoes echoing off the wood paneling, and placed the bill directly in front of Claire. "My condolences, Miss Caldwell," Gable said. His tone was professional, flat, devoid of any human warmth. Claire stared at the face of George Washington. The green ink seemed to mock her. She had arranged for a neighbor to watch Leo today. She had spent her last $10 on an Uber just to get to this office without looking like a drowned rat, a mission she had spectacularly failed. She had allowed herself, just for a fleeting, desperate moment on the ride over, to hope. She had hoped for maybe $10,000, even $5,000, just enough to pay off the eviction notice taped to her apartment door and buy Leo the winter boots he so desperately needed. Instead, she was publicly humiliated, a punchline from beyond the grave. The sheer absurdity of the situation hit her all at once. The snickering relatives, the billionaire uncle taking the time to write a legally binding insult, the high-powered lawyer hand-delivering a $1 bill. Claire felt a bubble of pressure rise in her chest. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She threw her head back and let out a loud, genuine, echoing laugh. The snickering around the table instantly stopped. Sylvia recoiled as if Claire had just coughed disease into the air. "Is something humorous, Claire?" Sylvia snapped, her fake pearls clicking against her collarbone. "Uncle Arthur always knew you were a disappointment. It seems even in death his judgment was sound." Claire picked up the dollar bill, folded it neatly, and slipped it into the pocket of her damp coat. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "No, Aunt Sylvia," Claire said, a bright, dangerous smile plastered across her face. "It's just incredibly fitting. Thank you all for the lovely family reunion. Enjoy the vineyard, Bea. I hear the soil there is almost as toxic as your personality." Without waiting for a response, Claire turned on her heel and walked out of the conference room. She kept her head high, her posture rigid, until she reached the elevator. The moment the steel doors closed, the smile vanished. Her knees buckled slightly, and she leaned heavily against the cold metal wall, burying her face in her hands. The dollar bill felt heavy in her pocket, a heavy weight of finality. She was truly, completely on her own. The reality of her situation settled back in the moment Claire unlocked the deadbolt to her cramped, one-bedroom apartment in the industrial edge of Ballard. The air inside smelled of old cooking grease and the damp mildew that permanently lived in the bathroom walls. "Mom!" Leo, a small, dark-haired boy with eyes too observant for a 7-year-old, came running from the tiny living room. He wrapped his arms around her waist. Claire immediately dropped to her knees, hugging him tight, burying her face in his messy hair. The warmth of his small body was the only thing holding her together. "Hey, Bug," she whispered, forcing a cheerful tone. "Did you behave for Mrs. Gableton?" "Yeah. She let me watch cartoons." "Did you get the money from the rich uncle?" Leo asked innocently, pulling back to look at her. Claire's heart cracked. She had tried to keep the details vague, but kids always knew. She forced a smile, reaching into her pocket and pulling out the crisp dollar bill. "I did," she said, holding it up. "We got a whole $1. And you know what that means? It means we can go to the corner store tomorrow and get exactly 2 cherry sour belts. One for you, one for me." Leo's face fell for a fraction of a second before he masked it, a defense mechanism he had learned entirely too early in life. "Cool. We can share them." That night, after feeding Leo a dinner of generic brand macaroni and cheese mixed with sliced hot dogs, Claire sat at the tiny Formica kitchen table. The eviction notice sat next to her stack of unpaid bills. She had precisely $46 in her checking account. Her next shift at the diner wasn't for 2 days. She stared at the $1 bill she had placed in the center of the table, a monument to her failure. At 11:42 p.m., her cell phone vibrated violently against the cheap wood. Claire jumped. The screen flashed an unknown number. Her stomach tightened. Usually, late-night calls were debt collectors who ignored time zones, or worse, Richard calling after a few drinks to remind her how badly she had ruined her own life by leaving him. She let it ring 3 times before reluctantly hitting accept. "Hello? Miss Caldwell. It's Thomas Gable." Claire frowned, confusion washing over her. "Mr. Gable? Is this a joke? Because if you're calling to ask for change for my inheritance, I'm afraid I've already allocated the funds." "Miss Caldwell, please listen to me very carefully." Gable's voice was completely different from the smooth, arrogant tone he had used in the conference room. It was urgent, clipped, and incredibly tense. "Are you alone? I'm in my apartment. My son is asleep. What do you want? I need you to pack a bag. Just the essentials. Clothes for you and your son for a few days. Birth certificates, whatever meager cash you have. I am pulling up to your building in precisely 10 minutes. Excuse me? Are you out of your mind? I'm not going anywhere with you." "Claire," Gable said, using her first name, a desperate edge bleeding into his voice. "The reading today. The dollar bill. It was a decoy. It was a legal requirement to execute the public phase of Arthur's will. I needed your family to believe you were cut out. I needed them to see you walk away." Claire froze. The hair on her arms stood up. "What are you talking about? Arthur didn't leave you $1, Claire. He left you everything. But your family, they are not the kind of people who let billions slip through their fingers without blood being spilled. And worse, your ex-husband, Richard, has been monitoring the firm's communications. If he knew what Arthur actually left you, he would have you in court tomorrow morning, filing for emergency custody of Leo to seize control of the assets." Claire's breath hitched at the mention of Richard. The sheer terror of losing Leo was the one thing that could override her skepticism. "Why should I believe you?" she whispered. "Look out your window," Gable commanded. Claire walked over to the grimy living room window and pulled back the cheap plastic blind. Down on the rain-slicked street, parked directly under the flickering amber street lamp, was a massive, blacked-out Mercedes G-Wagon. The driver's side window rolled down just enough for her to see the pale, illuminated face of Thomas Gable looking up at her apartment. "I am coming downstairs," Claire said, her voice shaking. If this were a trick, Claire, I wouldn't be risking my career and my life to get you out of Seattle." 10 minutes. The line went dead. Panic and adrenaline flooded her system. She didn't know if she was making the biggest mistake of her life or escaping it. She sprinted into the bedroom, pulling a duffel bag from the closet. She threw in Leo's clothes, her own jeans and sweaters, her meager folder of important documents, and Leo's favorite stuffed bear. She woke Leo gently. "Hey, baby, wake up. We're going on an adventure." Leo rubbed his eyes, groggy and confused. "Now? It's dark." "I know. It's a secret mission," she whispered, wrapping him in his thickest jacket. 10 minutes later, Claire rushed out of the rusted front doors of her apartment building, carrying Leo on her hip and dragging the duffel bag. The back door of the G-Wagon swung open. Claire threw the bag in and strapped a half-asleep Leo into the back seat before climbing into the passenger side. The moment her door slammed shut, Gable hit the locks and accelerated, the heavy tires tearing away from the curb. "Where are we going?" Claire demanded, her heart hammering against her ribs as she stared at the lawyer. In the dim light of the dashboard, Gable looked exhausted. His tie was undone, and there was a frantic energy about him that terrified her. "Out of the city," Gable said, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. "Arthur had a sanctuary, a place off the grid. It's the only place the asset transfer can be finalized without triggering a public record that Richard's lawyers can access." "Asset transfer?" Claire asked. "You said he left me everything. What is everything?" Gable let out a humorless chuckle, steering the heavy vehicle onto the I-90 on-ramp, heading east toward the imposing, dark silhouette of the Cascade Mountains. "Your Uncle Arthur was a very paranoid man, Claire," Gable said, his grip tight on the steering wheel. "He believed that extreme wealth was a disease. He watched it rot his brother and sister. He watched it turn your Aunt Sylvia into a monster. So he hid it. All of it. Hid it where? in a blind trust, a trust that, legally, only unlocks upon the presentation of a specific physical key. A key? Claire asked. Reach into your pocket, Claire, Gable instructed, his eyes fixed on the dark, winding highway ahead. Take out the dollar. Frowning, Claire reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the crisp dollar bill. Look at the serial number, Gable said. Claire flicked on the overhead reading light. She squinted at the green numbers printed on the face of the bill. It wasn't a standard, randomized serial number. It was a sequence of letters and numbers that didn't follow Treasury Department standards. Arcadia optatru, shapte doi noa, unu. That is not a serial number, Gable explained, his voice low over the hum of the engine. That is the access code to the Arcadia Trust, a private, sovereign wealth fund managed out of Switzerland. That dollar bill, authenticated by its unique watermark, is the only physical proof of ownership. If I had handed you a document, Richard could subpoena it. If I handed you a key, it could be stolen. But a single dollar bill, passed to a disgraced relative in front of witnesses who laughed at it. It was the perfect sleight of hand. Claire stared at the bill in her hands. It felt like it was burning her skin. How much is in the trust? Gable glanced at her, his expression grim. Liquid capital? Around $2.4 billion. Claire stopped breathing. The air was entirely sucked from her lungs. Billion? With a B? Yes. But the money is the easy part, Gable said, the car slicing through the thickening fog as they climbed higher into the mountain pass. The hard part is the estate, because Arthur didn't just leave you money. He left you his life's work. And right now, there are people, dangerous people, who want it back. They drove for nearly 3 hours. Leo remained fast asleep in the back, blissfully unaware that his life had just shattered and reassembled itself in the span of a single night. The city lights of Seattle had long since faded, replaced by the suffocating darkness of the deep Pacific Northwest forests. The rain had turned into a thick, swirling mist that clung to the towering Douglas firs like ghosts. Claire sat in stunned silence. $2.4 billion. The number was so astronomically large that it didn't even register as real money. It felt abstract. What felt real was the deep, gnawing anxiety churning in her gut. Dangerous people. Gable turned the G-Wagon off the paved highway onto a rugged, unlit gravel logging road. The heavy vehicle jostled violently. We are almost there, Gable said, breaking the long silence. Where is there? Claire asked, gripping the leather handle above the door. Arthur called it Blackwood, Gable replied. It's not just a house, it's a fortress. He bought over 4,000 acres of virgin timberland in the Snoqualmie Valley 40 years ago. There are no public records of the structures built upon it. It operates on a closed-loop geothermal grid. Why did he need a fortress? Claire asked, the fear creeping back into her throat. Gable didn't answer immediately. He slowed the vehicle. Emerging from the dense fog ahead were 2 massive, wrought-iron gates, standing at least 20 feet tall and anchored into solid stone pillars. The gates were heavily rusted, looking as though they hadn't been opened in a century. Gable pressed a button on the overhead console. A hidden scanner embedded in the stone pillar emitted a faint red laser, sweeping over the windshield of the Mercedes. A moment later, a heavy, metallic groan echoed through the silent forest, and the massive iron gates slowly swung inward. As they drove through, Claire noticed the cameras. They weren't standard security cameras. They were high-tech, military-grade optics, completely concealed within the surrounding tree line, their lenses catching the briefest glint of the headlights. They wound their way up a steep, twisting driveway carved directly into the side of the mountain. Finally, the trees broke, revealing a sprawling plateau. Claire gasped. Standing in the center of the clearing was not a cabin, nor a mansion. It looked like a modern castle, crossed with a brutalist bunker. Built of dark, rough-hewn stone and massive panes of blackened glass, it was breathtakingly large and incredibly intimidating. It loomed against the stormy sky, completely unlit, a dark leviathan resting in the mountains. Gable pulled up to the massive oak front doors and killed the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor," Gable said quietly. Claire unbuckled her seatbelt, her hands shaking. She climbed into the back, carefully lifting a sleeping Leo into her arms, grabbing her duffel bag. She stepped out into the freezing mountain air. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and wet earth. Gable walked up to the front doors. There was no keyhole. Instead, a biometric panel slid out from the stone wall. Gable pressed his thumb to the glass, and a heavy electronic lock disengaged with a solid thud. He pushed the heavy doors open. "After you," he said. Claire stepped over the threshold, clutching Leo tightly to her chest. As she entered, motion sensors triggered, and a wave of soft, warm, amber light flooded the interior. The grand foyer was staggering. A massive, sweeping staircase made of dark walnut led up to a gallery. The floors were polished black marble. But it wasn't the luxury that caught Claire's attention. It was what filled the space. The walls were lined with glass display cases, stretching floor to ceiling. Inside them were antiquities that looked like they belonged in the Louvre. There were ancient suits of samurai armor, gleaming golden chalices, intricately carved jade statues, and massive, bound leather tomes that looked hundreds of years old. "What is all this?" Claire whispered, spinning in a slow circle. "Arthur's collection," Gable said, locking the heavy front doors behind them and engaging a deadbolt system that sounded like a bank vault sealing shut. Arthur didn't just invest in stocks, Claire. He invested in history. He believed the world was going to undergo a massive economic collapse, and that true wealth would only be held in physical, irreplaceable artifacts. He became the world's foremost private buyer of black market and reclaimed antiquities. Gable led her through the foyer and into a massive, cavernous study. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, and a large mahogany desk much like the one in Gable's office sat in the center. "You can put your son down on the sofa," Gable offered gently. Claire carefully laid Leo down on a plush, leather Chesterfield sofa, pulling a cashmere throw blanket from the back of the chair over him. She turned back to the lawyer. "Okay, Thomas," Claire said, her voice finding its steel. "You brought me to the middle of nowhere. You told me I'm a billionaire. Now tell me what the catch is, because in my life, there is always a catch." Gable walked over to the mahogany desk. He pressed a sequence of buttons hidden underneath the lip of the wood. A motorized whirring sound filled the room, and a section of the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves slid back, revealing a massive stainless steel safe embedded in the rock wall. Gable turned the dial, entering a complex combination. He pulled the heavy door open and withdrew a thick, leather-bound dossier. He walked back to Claire and dropped it on the desk. "The catch, Claire, is twofold," Gable said, looking her dead in the eye. "First, Arthur didn't die of a sudden heart attack, as the family was told." Claire stared at him. "What?" "His autopsy report was doctored. I paid the medical examiner to alter it. Arthur was poisoned. A rare, synthesized neurotoxin was introduced into his evening tea. He knew he was being hunted, which is why he expedited the drafting of this new will." A cold sweat broke out on the back of Claire's neck. "Who poisoned him?" "We don't know," Gable admitted grimly. "But we have a strong suspicion it was either your Uncle Robert or a proxy hired by a syndicate of rival collectors who have been trying to acquire Blackwood's inventory for a decade. Arthur's collection is worth more than his liquid trust. There are items in this house that governments would kill for. And you brought me here?" Claire yelled, keeping her voice low so as not to wake Leo, but the panic was boiling over. "If they killed him for it, they will kill me." "They don't know you have it," Gable countered sharply. That was the entire point of the $1 charade. "To the world and to your family, you are a destitute, divorced mother who got publicly humiliated and cut out. They are currently ripping each other apart in Seattle, trying to find where Arthur hid the bulk of his estate. As long as you are here, You are a ghost." Gable opened the leather dossier. Inside were hundreds of pages of legal documents, bank statements, and blueprints. "But that brings us to the second catch," Gable continued, his voice heavy. He pulled a single, handwritten letter from the dossier and slid it toward her. "Arthur didn't leave you all this just to save you from poverty. He left it to you because he believed you were the only one ruthless enough to protect it." Claire looked down at the letter. It was written in thick, black fountain pen ink. The handwriting was sharp and jagged. "My dearest Claire, if you are reading this, Thomas has successfully executed the final performance. I apologize for the dollar. I know it must have stung, but you have always possessed a spine of iron, far stronger than the spineless sycophants who share our bloodline. You survived the pendulum of poverty. You survived the psychological warfare of that parasite you married. You know what it means to fight for survival. That is why I have chosen you. Blackwood is yours. The Arcadia Trust is yours. But they are not merely gifts. They are a garrison. Below this house lies the vault. Within it is a ledger. It contains the names of every corrupt politician, every corporate criminal, and every black market syndicate I have done business with to build this sanctuary. They took my life to find it. They will tear the world apart to get it. Do not let them. Trust Thomas. Trust the walls of Blackwood. And above all, trust no one with the name Pendleton. Survive, Claire. Arthur." Claire finished reading the letter, her hands trembling so badly the paper rattled. She looked at Leo, sleeping peacefully on the leather sofa, clutching his cheap stuffed bear. Yesterday, her biggest fear was not being able to buy him winter boots. Today, she was sitting on a multi-billion-dollar empire, hiding from assassins in a mountain fortress. "So," Gable said quietly, stepping forward, "are you going to run, Claire? Or are you going to claim your inheritance?" Claire looked from the letter to Gable, and then out the massive windows into the pitch-black, stormy forest. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the $1 bill with the Arcadia code. She smoothed the wrinkled paper against the mahogany desk. "I'm not running," Claire said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I've spent the last 2 years running from a man who took everything from me. I'm done running." She looked up at Gable, her eyes blazing with a newfound, terrifying resolve. "Show me the vault." The heavy steel door concealed behind the mahogany bookshelves hissed open, revealing an industrial elevator lined with brushed steel and bulletproof glass. Evelyn stood before it, clutching the crisp $1 bill. The name, Claire Caldwell, the identity she had worn like a suffocating mask for the past 32 years, was dead. Her great-uncle, Alistair Hawthorne, had created the Pendleton family front decades ago, a brilliant, paranoid web of shell corporations and decoy relatives meant to draw the world's attention away from the true Hawthorne bloodline. Aunt Valerie, Uncle Preston, the entire venomous lot of them back in Seattle. They were nothing but paid actors and distant, greedy cousins propped up to look like billionaires, while Alistair quietly amassed his shadow empire here at Ironcrest Manor. To the world, and to her vicious ex-husband Donovan, she was destitute Claire, the disgraced niece of a dying eccentric. But here, breathing in the cold, filtered air of the mountain fortress, she was Evelyn Hawthorne. The biometric scanners on the elevator will only recognize Hawthorne DNA, Thomas Gable explained, stepping back to let her enter first. But the vault itself requires the physical key, the Arcadia code on that dollar bill. Evelyn stepped into the elevator. Gable followed, pressing his thumb to a glowing panel to initiate the descent. The elevator dropped smoothly, the silence thick and heavy. They descended for what felt like miles into the bedrock of the Snoqualmie Valley. When the doors finally parted, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. They stepped out into a subterranean cavern that rivaled the size of an airplane hangar. The walls were reinforced with thick concrete and crisscrossed with steel beams. Rows upon rows of climate-controlled, glass-fronted server racks hummed with a low, rhythmic vibration. Beyond the servers sat dozens of massive, antique Mosler bank safes. But it wasn't the wealth that made her stop in her tracks. It was the man waiting for them at the center of the room. He stepped out of the shadows cast by the server towers, moving with the silent, lethal grace of an apex predator. He was tall, his broad shoulders filling out a tailored, charcoal gray suit that couldn't hide the coiled tension of the muscle beneath. His hair was dark, swept back from a face that looked like it had been carved from granite, marred only by a thin, faded scar cutting through his left eyebrow. His eyes, a piercing, icy silver, locked onto Evelyn with a terrifying intensity. "Gable," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that seemed to vibrate in Evelyn's chest. "You brought her." "Evelyn," Thomas said softly, gesturing to the man. "This is Roman. He was Alistair's head of security and the architect of Ironcrest's physical defenses. He commands the private security detail that guards this valley." Roman closed the distance between them. Evelyn instinctively held her ground, refusing to step back, though the sheer, dominating alpha energy radiating from him made every survival instinct in her brain scream. He stopped mere inches from her, his silver eyes mapping every feature of her face, searching for weakness. "Alistair said you had iron in your spine," Roman murmured, the dangerous edge in his voice softening just a fraction. "He said you survived Donovan's psychological slaughterhouse without breaking." "I bent," Evelyn corrected him, her voice remarkably steady. "I didn't break, and my son and I are still breathing." A shadow of a smile touched the corner of Roman's mouth. "It was a terrifying, beautiful thing." "Then you are exactly who Alistair promised. Ironcrest is yours, Miss Hawthorne. My men and I answer exclusively to you. The perimeter is sealed. A tactical strike team couldn't breach these mountains without my permission." Evelyn felt a strange, sudden flush of heat at his words. For years, she had been entirely unprotected, completely at the mercy of men who wanted to ruin her. Looking at Roman, a man who radiated violence but offered her complete allegiance, something dormant and wild woke up inside her. "Show her the ledger, Roman," Gable instructed. Roman nodded, turning and walking toward a sleek, black marble pedestal in the center of the room. Resting atop it was a massive, leather-bound book, heavily reinforced with iron clasps. Beside it was a high-resolution optical scanner. "The servers house the Arcadia Trust," Roman explained, his deep voice echoing in the cavern. $2.4 billion in liquid, untraceable assets channeled through Bordier and C, one of the oldest private banks in Geneva. But this, he rested his large, calloused hand on the leather book. "This is the true inheritance, the ledger." Evelyn walked up to the pedestal. She placed the $1 bill onto the optical scanner. A green laser swept over the unique serial code ARCADIA 847291 and a loud, mechanical clack echoed through the room as the iron clasps on the book released. She opened the heavy cover. The pages were filled with names, dates, offshore account numbers, and explicit details of crimes. "Alistair brokered antiquities for the worst people on Earth," Roman said, stepping close behind her. She could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "Oligarchs, corrupt senators, cartel bosses. He took their money, but he also kept their secrets. This book contains the evidence to dismantle 70 of the most powerful families on the planet. They poisoned him to get it. They sent assassins to find it. But Alistair hid it here and gave you the key." Evelyn stared at the pages. She saw the name of a prominent Seattle judge, the very judge who had presided over her divorce and awarded Donovan a sweeping victory. She saw the names of senators. She saw the names of private wealth fixers. "They destroyed my life because they thought I was weak," Evelyn whispered, her fingertips tracing the ink. "The humiliation of the $1 inheritance, the years of poverty, the terror of Donovan taking her son, it all boiled over, hardening into a cold, diamond-sharp rage." She looked up at Roman, her hazel eyes completely devoid of fear. "If I have the Arcadia Trust, And I have this ledger. That means I can destroy them. All of them. Roman's silver eyes flashed with dark approval. Tell me where you want to start, Evelyn. Give me a target, and I will tear their world apart. 300 miles away, in the mahogany-paneled smoking lounge of the Rainier Club in downtown Seattle, Donovan was celebrating. He tipped his crystal tumbler of Macallan 25, the amber liquid catching the low light of the chandelier, and smiled at the man sitting across from him. Donovan was a man who wore his wealth like a weapon, impeccably tailored, viciously handsome, and completely devoid of empathy. To dead eccentrics, Donovan said, clinking his glass against the one held by Julian Vance, a high-level wealth manager for a notoriously corrupt private equity firm. To dead eccentrics, Vance agreed, taking a sip. I heard the reading of the will was quite the spectacle. I'm told your ex-wife was handed a $1 bill and laughed out of the room. Donovan chuckled, a cold, dry sound. It was beautiful. By the end of the month, she'll be evicted. When she is officially homeless, I file the emergency injunction. The courts will strip her of custody, and Mason will be back in my house, entirely under my control. She'll have absolutely nothing. A masterclass in litigation, Vance praised smoothly. But let's get to the real business. My employers are highly interested in the rumors surrounding Alistair's hidden assets, the antiquities. The rumor is that the Pendleton family assets were just a smokescreen. They were, Donovan confirmed, leaning forward. Valerie and Preston are tearing apart the estate's public records, but they're idiots. Alistair was hiding something massive. If your firm can help me locate the shell companies, I guarantee you a 40% cut of whatever we seize. Vance smiled, reaching for his phone as it buzzed violently on the table. I believe we have a deal, Donovan. Vance looked down at his screen. The smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a pale, sickly dread. He stared at the message, his mouth slightly open. What is it? Donovan asked, frowning. My firm's servers, Vance stammered. We've just been locked out of our primary offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. A hostile takeover of our holding company was just executed. Hostile takeover? By who? A sovereign wealth fund, Vance whispered, his hands beginning to shake. The Arcadia Trust. Before Donovan could ask what that meant, his own phone rang. The caller ID flashed the name of his chief financial officer. Annoyed, Donovan answered. What is it, Greg? I'm in a meeting. Sir, Greg's voice was pitched in absolute panic. Our credit lines, they've been frozen. Every single one of them. Donovan stood up, knocking his chair back. What are you talking about? Who froze them? The banks won't say. They just received a massive data dump detailing our tax evasion strategies and the bribes paid to Judge Harmon during your divorce proceedings. Sir, the feds are already outside the building. Donovan dropped his phone. It shattered against the hardwood floor. Back at Ironcrest Manor, Evelyn sat in the command center adjacent to the vault. The room was illuminated by the blue glow of a dozen massive monitors, displaying real-time financial data, bank transfers, and security feeds. Roman stood directly behind her chair, his hands resting lightly on the backrest, an imposing, protective shadow. Donovan's primary real estate firm is currently in freefall, Thomas Gable announced from a keyboard to Evelyn's left. The Arcadia Trust just shorted his stock, while simultaneously leaking the blackmail material from the ledger regarding his offshore accounts. His net worth has dropped by $40 million in the last 12 minutes. Evelyn watched the red lines plummeting on the screen. There was no joy in it, only a profound, settling sense of justice, hard karma. Donovan had used money to break her. Now, she was using it to erase him. And Valerie and Preston? Evelyn asked, not taking her eyes off the screen. I have instructed our proxy lawyers to file lawsuits contesting their ownership of the decoy assets, Gable said. They will be tied up in litigation for the next decade, completely bankrupting them in legal fees. Evelyn leaned back in her chair. The air in the bunker was cool, but she felt a strange, intoxicating warmth. She turned her head slightly, looking up at Roman. "Donovan isn't going to just accept this," Evelyn said quietly, the reality of the war setting in. "When he realizes his firm is destroyed, he's going to come looking for whoever did it. He's going to use the same fixers who poisoned Alistair." Roman leaned down, his face so close to hers she could feel his breath against her cheek. The scent of him, cedar, rain, and cold steel, was overwhelming. "Let him come," Roman whispered, his silver eyes flashing with a predatory thrill. "I built Ironcrest to withstand an army. Let Donovan bring his fixers and his assassins into my woods. They will never leave them." Evelyn held his gaze, her heart beating a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't just surviving anymore. With billions of dollars at her fingertips, a fortress to protect her son, and a lethal protector standing at her back, Evelyn Hawthorne was finally going to war. The financial slaughter of Donovan's empire took precisely 48 hours. From the subterranean command center of Ironcrest, Evelyn watched the screens as the Arcadia Trust systematically dismantled every shell company, credit line, and offshore account her ex-husband possessed. It was a digital bloodbath. Donovan's real estate firm collapsed under sudden federal investigations. His properties were seized, and the corrupt judge who had stripped Evelyn of her assets was indicted by the Department of Justice following an anonymous leak of the ledger's files. But a cornered animal is the most dangerous kind. Donovan had not become a multimillionaire purely by legal means. When the white-collar avenues closed, he turned to the shadows. Through encrypted channels, he liquidated his remaining illicit physical assets, diamonds and bearer bonds, kept in a private safety deposit box, and hired a specialized black market retrieval team, led by a mercenary named Sullivan. Their objective was simple: trace the origin of the massive digital attack, locate the Arcadia Trust's physical server, and eliminate whoever was pulling the strings. They managed to trace the signal to the dense, unmapped wilderness of the Snoqualmie Valley. At Ironcrest, the atmosphere shifted from triumphant to brutally tense. Roman, the architect of the estate's defenses, moved through the massive stone corridors with the coiled energy of a predator preparing for a siege. He had completely locked down the estate. The blast doors were sealed, the biometric scanners were set to lethal response mode, and his private security detail was stationed in the surrounding timberland, draped in thermal camouflage. Evelyn found Roman in the estate's underground armory. The room smelled of gun oil, cold steel, and the distinct, masculine scent of cedar and rain that always clung to him. He was methodically loading armor-piercing rounds into heavy magazines. "They found the valley," Roman said without looking up, his deep, gravelly voice echoing off the concrete walls. Thermal satellites picked up 3 unauthorized choppers, landing 5 miles outside the perimeter grid. Sullivan's team. They're moving on foot through the forest to avoid radar. Evelyn felt a cold spike of adrenaline, but the paralyzing fear that used to define her life with Donovan was gone. Can they breach the house? Roman finally looked up. His silver eyes met hers, intense and burning with a fierce, protective fire. "Nothing breaches this house, Evelyn, but I am not going to let them get close enough to look at the glass." He stepped toward her, closing the distance until he was mere inches away. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gently but firmly gripping her shoulders. The heat, radiating from his palms, sent a shockwave through her nervous system. "I built this fortress to keep the monsters out, but you need to know how to protect yourself if the absolute worst happens." Roman turned her slightly, picking up a sleek, matte black Sig Sauer handgun from the table. He pressed it into her hands, moving behind her, his chest pressed against her back, hard and unyielding. He guided her arms up, adjusting her grip, his fingers wrapping completely over hers. "Breathe," he murmured, his lips brushing the shell of her ear, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the freezing mountain air. "You are not the prey anymore, Evelyn. You are the apex." "I've never fired a gun," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. though she leaned back into his solid warmth, finding an anchor in his strength. "You survived, Donovan," Roman whispered fiercely, his grip tightening. "Pulling a trigger is easy compared to that. You hold the power now. No one will ever take your son away. I swear it on my life." The raw, unfiltered loyalty in his vow struck her deeply. For the first time in her life, she wasn't fighting alone. She had a protector who was willing to wade through blood to ensure her safety. Evelyn steadied her breathing, staring down the iron sights, her finger resting against the trigger guard. She was ready. The assault began at 2 a.m. under the cover of a torrential mountain thunderstorm. The heavy rain masked the sound of Sullivan's mercenaries cutting through the outer chain-link fences. They were highly trained, equipped with night vision optics and suppressed weapons, moving like ghosts through the towering Douglas firs. Inside the vault, Evelyn sat before the massive wall of security monitors, Mason asleep on a cot beside her, entirely unaware of the violence descending upon them. Thomas Gable stood pacing nervously by the servers. "They've crossed the eastern ridge," Gable said, pointing to a monitor displaying thermal imaging. 6 glowing red silhouettes were advancing up the steep incline toward the plateau where Ironcrest sat. "Where is Roman?" Evelyn asked, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. "He's not in the house," Gable replied, his face pale. "He ordered his men to hold the perimeter line. He went into the woods alone. He said he prefers to hunt in the dark." On the screen, Evelyn watched in breathless terror and awe. The 6 red silhouettes moved in a tight, tactical formation. Suddenly, one of the silhouettes vanished. There was no muzzle flash, no explosion. The man simply disappeared into the canopy of the forest, pulled silently into the darkness. A moment later, the thermal camera picked up a massive, fast-moving heat signature dropping from the branches above. It was Roman. He moved with terrifying, brutal efficiency, striking with the lethal grace of a shadow. He didn't rely on firearms that would give away his position. He used the environment, slipping between the ancient trees, dismantling the strike team one by one. The mercenaries broke formation, panic visible even on the thermal feed as they began firing wildly into the dark woods, shooting at ghosts. "He's tearing them apart," Gable whispered, absolute shock in his voice. Evelyn's breath hitched. She watched Roman disarm the team leader, Sullivan, in a blur of motion, driving him into the muddy earth. The remaining mercenaries, realizing they had walked into a slaughterhouse, abandoned the mission and fled back down the mountain, disappearing into the storm. 10 minutes later, the heavy steel doors of the vault hissed open. Roman stepped inside. He was soaked to the bone, his dark hair plastered to his forehead, his tactical gear covered in mud and pine needles. A jagged cut across his cheekbone was bleeding sluggishly, but his silver eyes were blazing with savage triumph. Evelyn didn't think. The sheer relief shattered her composure. She ran across the concrete floor and threw her arms around his neck, burying her face in his wet, armored chest. Roman froze for a fraction of a second before his massive arms wrapped around her waist, lifting her off the ground, crushing her against him. He buried his face in her neck, his breathing heavy and ragged. "They're gone," Roman rasped, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe, and she never wanted him to let go. "The perimeter is secure. You're safe." "You came back," Evelyn whispered, tears mixing with the rain on his skin. "I will always come back to you," he vowed, pulling back just enough to look fiercely into her eyes. The unspoken promise hanging in the air between them was heavier than any vault door. The Alpha had defended his territory, and he had claimed her as his own. By dawn, the violent mountain storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving the sprawling grounds of Ironcrest Manor shrouded in a thick, chilling layer of dense fog. The relentless pounding of the rain had been replaced by a heavy, ringing silence. The immediate physical threat to the estate had been completely neutralized. The mercenaries scattered and broken. But as Evelyn sat in the sterile glow of the underground command center, she knew the war was not truly over. A fortress could protect her from bullets, but true safety would only come when the man who ordered the strike was entirely, irrevocably eradicated. Sitting at the massive mahogany desk, Evelyn opened the heavy, iron-clasped ledger. The ancient, thick paper smelled of dust and dangerous secrets. Roman stood rigidly at her right side, his towering presence a constant, grounding force. The adrenaline of the night's brutal combat still radiated from him, but his silver eyes were fixed solely on her, watching her transition from a survivor into a conqueror. Donovan was completely cornered. His lucrative real estate firm was publicly bankrupt. His hired black market mercenaries had failed spectacularly, and federal agents were actively tearing his Seattle penthouse down to the studs. He was a man who had built his entire opulent life on a foundation of absolute control, and now he was drowning in a rapidly shrinking cage of his own making. "He's at Boeing Field," Thomas Gable announced, breaking the quiet of the bunker. The lawyer's fingers flew frantically across the illuminated keyboard of the mainframe. "He's trying to board a private charter jet to non-extradition territory in South America. The flight takes off in 20 minutes. Evelyn stared at the glowing monitors, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, unyielding ice. "Stop him. I can freeze his passport digitally," Gable offered, his eyes darting between the tracking screens. "I can flag him on the international no-fly list, but the pilot is a private contractor. If Donovan offers him a large enough cash bribe, he might just take off completely off the radar. Then we make sure the authorities get there first," Evelyn stated smoothly, her voice betraying absolutely no panic. She turned her attention back to the ledger, tracing the black ink with her fingertip until she found exactly what she was looking for. There they were, the highly encrypted offshore accounts Donovan had used for years to quietly funnel and launder cartel money. Below them lay the damning transactional records of the massive bribes he had paid to the presiding judge to systematically strip Evelyn of her rightful assets during their divorce. With a few precise, methodical keystrokes, Evelyn transferred the unredacted files. She included the indisputable digital signatures, the hidden account routing numbers, and the precise, real-time GPS coordinates of the chartered Gulfstream jet. Without a second thought, she transmitted the entire package directly to the highest tiers of the FBI, the SEC, and the DEA simultaneously. 300 miles away, the heavy Seattle fog clung to the damp tarmac of Boeing Field. Donovan sat strapped into the luxurious, cream-colored leather seat of the idling jet, his entire body trembling violently as he poured a generous measure of Macallan into a crystal tumbler. The amber liquid sloshed over the rim, staining his cuffs. He had lost absolutely everything. His billions had simply evaporated into the digital ether in less than 2 days. He couldn't comprehend how a supposedly destitute, dead eccentric's estate could wield this kind of apocalyptic, terrifying power. Suddenly, his encrypted cell phone buzzed against the polished walnut table. The screen flashed an unknown, blocked number. Desperate, paranoid, and hoping it was his offshore fixer calling with an escape route, he snatched it up. "Hello?" Donovan barked, his voice cracking with barely contained panic. "Enjoying the flight, Donovan?" The crystal tumbler slipped entirely from Donovan's trembling fingers, shattering against the plush carpet and soaking into the floorboards. The blood drained instantly from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, ashen gray. He recognized that voice instantly. It was soft, yes, but it was laced with a terrifying, absolute steel that he had never heard from her before. "Claire?" he whispered, his vocal cords paralyzed with utter shock. "My name is Evelyn Hawthorne," she corrected him smoothly over the secure, untraceable line. "You thought you broke me. You thought you could throw me to the wolves with a $1 bill and watch me starve. But you forgot one thing, Donovan." "What did you do?" Donovan screamed, his composure shattering entirely. Spittle flew from his lips as he gripped the armrests. "Give it back. You give my money back." "I am the wolf," Evelyn said coldly, the absolute truth of the words hanging heavy in the air. And I have taken absolutely everything. Look out your window." Panting, terrified, Donovan scrambled out of his seat and pressed his face against the oval window of the jet. Screeching onto the damp tarmac, sirens wailing like banshees and red and blue lights flashing violently through the morning fog, were half a dozen black, armored SUVs belonging to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Heavily armed agents in tactical gear were already swarming the steps of the plane, screaming orders for the pilot to cut the massive engines. "This is hard karma, Donovan," Evelyn whispered, her voice echoing in the quiet cabin of his doomed escape. "Enjoy the cage." She terminated the call. Donovan fell back into his seat, weeping openly and uncontrollably as the heavy cabin doors were violently breached. The man who had mercilessly mocked her, impoverished her, and threatened to steal her only child was finally dragged out into the cold morning air in heavy iron handcuffs, completely and permanently ruined. A month later, the world had fundamentally shifted. The relentless news cycle remained completely saturated by the spectacular, humiliating downfall of Donovan and his vast network of corrupt associates. He was a man who had built his entire existence on the illusion of absolute control, and now he was utterly powerless. Denied bail and facing multiple life sentences in a maximum security federal penitentiary, his assets were liquidated, his name was a toxic punchline, and his reign of psychological terror was permanently extinguished. The facade of the Decoy family had crumbled just as spectacularly. Valerie and Preston, completely bankrupted by the phantom lawsuits over Alistair's diversionary assets, had been unceremoniously evicted from their sprawling estates. They were forced to sell off their designer wardrobes just to afford a cramped, mold-scented apartment in the suburbs, a poetic, brutal reflection of the very life they had once sneered at Evelyn for enduring. The Hawthorne legacy was finally, indisputably secure. Evelyn Hawthorne stood on the expansive, reinforced glass balcony of Ironcrest Manor, a steaming ceramic mug of dark roast coffee warming her hands. The crisp morning sun broke over the jagged, snow-dusted peaks of the Cascades, casting a brilliant golden light over the 4,000 acres of pristine, untamed wilderness she now unequivocally owned. She took a deep breath, letting the sharp scent of pine and chilled mountain air fill her lungs. She wasn't wearing a damp, thrift store trench coat anymore, nor did she carry the bone-deep exhaustion of a woman drowning in debt. Today, she wore a luxuriously soft, tailored cashmere sweater and dark, perfectly fitted trousers. She exuded a quiet, absolute authority that had always lived inside her, finally unchained. Inside the cavernous great room behind her, the joyful sound of Mason's laughter echoed off the polished black marble floors. Evelyn glanced back through the glass to see her son sitting cross-legged by the massive, roaring stone fireplace, enthusiastically playing a game of chess with Thomas Gable. The lawyer had shed his stiff corporate armor, opting for a relaxed wool cardigan as he patiently explained a night's maneuver to the bright-eyed boy. The sheer, overwhelming relief of knowing her son would never again know hunger, fear, or the looming threat of his father's shadow brought a sudden, fierce sting of tears to Evelyn's eyes. She was the sole custodian of the Arcadia Trust, the keeper of the ledger, and one of the most powerful women on the planet. But that sound, Mason's unburdened laughter, was her greatest treasure. The heavy sliding glass door opened with a soft, mechanical hum. Evelyn didn't need to turn around to know who had stepped out onto the balcony. The subtle, grounding scent of cedar, rain, and cold steel preceded him. Roman walked up beside her, the harsh, lethal lines of his face, the face of a man who had dismantled a mercenary strike team with his bare hands in the dark, softened the absolute second his silver eyes landed on her. He leaned his thick forearms against the glass railing, his massive shoulders brushing against hers as he looked out over the sweeping valley. "Gable just wired the final transfer from Geneva," Roman said quietly, his deep, gravelly voice a soothing rumble in the quiet morning air. "The trust is fully integrated into the secure servers. The fortress is entirely locked down. The war is over." Evelyn turned to look at him. She studied the faded scar cutting through his eyebrow, the intense, unwavering loyalty burning in his gaze. "It's only over because of you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You stood in front of the storm. You kept us alive. You kept my son safe when the rest of the world wanted to feed us to the wolves." Roman reached out, his movements incredibly slow and deliberate. His large, calloused knuckles gently brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The fierce, terrifying bodyguard was entirely, devastatingly gentle with her. "I told you, Evelyn," he whispered fiercely. "My life belongs to you. This estate, this valley, every breath I take, it all belongs to you." "I don't just want the estate, Roman," Evelyn whispered, the last walls around her heart finally crumbling into dust. She closed the remaining distance between them, stepping fully into his space. She reached up, her hands sliding into his dark, thick hair, pulling him down toward her. "I want the man who defends it." Roman let out a low, rough groan, a possessive, deeply masculine sound that vibrated straight through her chest. He captured her lips in a deep, all-consuming kiss. It was a kiss forged in the brutal fire of survival, heavy with months of unspoken tension, overwhelming relief, and an undeniable, earth-shattering passion. His massive arms wrapped tightly around her waist, pulling her flush against his solid, unyielding chest, anchoring her to him as if he would never let her go. Evelyn closed her eyes, melting completely into his fierce embrace. Far beneath their feet, safely locked inside the subterranean vault, rested a single, crisp $1 bill. It was a constant, ironic reminder of exactly where she had started. She had laughed at the ultimate insult of a $1 inheritance, completely unaware that it was the master key to an empire. She had lost her false, suffocating life, but she had gained the world, an impenetrable fortress, and a love that was absolute and unbreakable. The storm finally broke, leaving the mountain air crisp and pure. Evelyn Hawthorne stood on the glass balcony of Ironcrest, looking out over her impenetrable domain. She was no longer the frightened, destitute mother, laughed out of a corporate law office for a single dollar. She had forged herself in the fires of betrayal and emerged unbroken, wielding the power of a hidden empire alongside a man who would burn the world to keep her safe. Donovan's greed had been his own spectacular undoing, sealing his fate in a concrete cell while Evelyn claimed the ultimate victory. Sometimes, the most brutal karma comes wrapped in a $1 bill.